Hello, my name is Rachel.
Sophia.
Jenny.
And we are your hosts for Let's Talk Racism, the show that sends a message to youth about racism and cultural diversity. As many of you know, racism has been a big issue all around the world. Furthermore, while anxiety and fear about the ongoing pandemic have been widespread, Asian-focused racist incidents and #Black Lives Matter protests have constantly been happening throughout the year.
It has also been a heavy year because of the murder of George Floyd. People have taken to the streets and to social media to express their anger, and maybe you have felt sad, angry, anxious, or confused, which is why we felt it was so important to continue our conversation about racism.
Our guest today is Bruce Harper. He's a retired federal prosecutor and a BC Chess Federation champion. He will be sharing his thoughts and opinions on racism today. Hi, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you, and how's your day been going?
It's been going pretty well considering the weather and everything else.
Great. So we're going to just go straight into it. So first, what are your thoughts on white supremacy?
Well, I think it's pathetic. And I guess if I were a racist, which I'm not, I'd probably be anti-white. But I don't think race is really, for me, a very useful way of categorizing people. So white racists really don't even embarrass me. They just kind of make me mad and sad, I guess.
Okay. Well, as a lawyer, did you witness any racism in your workplace?
I don't think so, at least nothing systemic. I mean, some people were worse than others, I guess, but that's always going to be the case. But I think if the federal government, which is where I work, was racist, that would probably show up mainly in their hiring practices, which is certainly not the case today. And I don't know if it was the case when I started, but then you'd only see the result because you, I guess, wouldn't see some people that might otherwise have been working there, but weren't for the wrong reasons. I think in the 1980s, when I started, that sexism was much more of a problem than racism, although I tend to lump the two and a lot of other things all together.
As a member of the majority group, do you think that you were treated differently in your workplace compared to the people of color and women?
Well, technically, Caucasians are not a majority group in Vancouver, just for the record. They're a plurality still, but I think when I started working, though, they were, and certainly in the office, it was, I'm trying to think now, I think there were about 20 prosecutors, and I think there were 5 women, so there were 15, well, 14 white males and 1 Chinese guy and 5 Caucasian women. So it was kind of hard to tell. I think that at the federal government, really at any time, that you weren't treated differently based on ethnic background. I can't think of any instances of that, to be honest. I think people were definitely treated differently on the basis of gender. So I think that was the main problem that they had to deal with. But I don't know if you're asking generally about racism or whether you're thinking specifically of that particular work environment.
Specifically in the work environment, did you see any racism or no?
Nothing I can remember, so I would have to say very little because I certainly would have noticed it.
Well, why do you think people nowadays treat people based on their skin tone?
Well, I think that's because there's a lot of people that are lazy and stupid. And it's human nature that people will always judge other people. You'll like some people and admire them, and you'll dislike some people and have contempt for them, and then there will be people in between. I know some people think it's just fundamentally wrong to judge other people.
Mhm.
But I don't agree with that. I mean, if you really take that strictly, you'd have to say, well, I'm not going to form an opinion about Hitler. I mean, like, who am I to say? You can't cop out like that. I think the real issue is on what basis are you going to judge other people?
Mhm.
And if you judge them on the things that matter, that takes a lot of work and a lot of thinking. If you want to judge them on skin color or appearance or gender or orientation or anything else that's superficial like that, it's a great substitute for thinking. And people find thinking hard. So, if you're white and you want to be a racist, you can convince yourself that all other whites are great and that blacks and Asians and anybody else that looks different is bad. But it's just a shortcut. I mean, there's lots of good reasons not to like people, especially these days. But find the good reasons and make up your mind on individual case by case instances, not just by looking at something that doesn't actually matter. So I think to me, that's the root cause of not only racism, but like every form of discrimination, that it's just so much easier to look at somebody and decide whether you like them or dislike them without knowing them or thinking about them.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the current climate regarding activism and awareness?
Well, I think it's a good thing.
Mhm.
But my concern about it, I guess, is that it doesn't really address the most important issue. Because if you're focusing on racism, then you're almost by definition ignoring or downplaying all the other equally bad forms of hate. So, and if someone hates you because you're Asian, you don't really feel better if they hate you because you're female, or because you're gay, or because you're short, or anything else. I mean, so it's all bad. And while there's some pretty obvious examples, especially in the United States, with the police killings and so on. I mean, you can't get much worse. Well, you can, but those are pretty graphic and clear examples of racism. But all of these different criteria for judging people and disliking them that are invalid, they're all bad. So I guess my concern is, yes, I mean, it's good that there's racism, but if you're having a march or a rally against, say it's a Black Lives Matter rally, and you're saying, okay, killing Black people because they're Black and all the things that lead up to that are bad, that's clearly true. But that's not the only problem, unfortunately, that the human race is trying to deal with. And so I don't think you can logically be, say, anti-racist without also opposing, say, sexism or a number of other isms. And I think definitely you'll find people that are legitimately and honestly anti-racist that, think women are inferior, for example. And I think that's hypocritical. I think it's inconsistent. I think you're either all in or you're not in at all. That came out more clever than I intended it to, but sorry.
Great, thank you. So in this era of political correctness, what is your response to people who claim society is becoming too sensitive? And where do you think we draw this line?
Well, I think that question's a bit difficult because there's something to the complaint.
Mhm.
I think that the human trait that is sort of at the root of all this, or much of it, is that a lot of people like to tell other people what to think and how to act.
Right.
And specifically that they should think and act like them.
Mm-hmm.
And by extension, look like them and everything else. And that trait, I think you'll find in racists and you'll find in anti-racists. And in every other dichotomy that we're talking about, where one group or people in a group discriminate against another group, that on both sides, people are going to want to tell other people how they should behave. Now, I'm not paraphrasing Trump and saying there's like good people on both sides. That's not always true, and it often isn't true. But the problem with political correctness is that, well, first of all, of course, it can go too far and that's human nature too, that people are always going to take something that's valid and screw it up by taking it too far. That's, people are always going to do that. But again, I think political correctness can be a substitute for thinking. So somebody can say something and someone else can think, well, that's not politically correct, therefore they're evil. And they don't know the person. They don't know the context that they're saying it in. They don't know what they mean. And there's certainly people that will speak in a politically correct way, but they don't think in a politically correct way. And they're like bad. So they can be racist, but they know enough to hide it. And, the problem with political correctness, I think, is that it tends to ignore these nuances that are actually very important, again, because it's easier than thinking and easier than judging every situation, whether what a professor said in a lecture is actually appropriate, whether what a politician said in a speech is actually bad, or whether it's a meaningless slip. I think political correctness has caused, of course, a reaction, especially in the United States, because some people have convinced themselves that nothing they do can be right. So if they're going to be crapped on, they might as well, get in trouble for just being overtly racist and awful. But of course, that's not a logical conclusion either. So I don't know. Political correctness, I think, you guys play Cards Against Humanity? I would assume you do. Well, there's a shameless plug for a product that I actually have nothing to do with, but it's not politically correct, but it's very funny. And I don't think it's evil, but you can say things that are racist or sexist or anything else that are actually very hurtful and intentionally hurtful and bad, or not. And political correctness doesn't really guide you through that.
Do you have tips on remaining respectful when discussing topics of identity and cultural differences?
If that question is, how can you be respectful to people when you're discussing sensitive topics that they're ignorant on, I guess you have to be patient and realize that the generations that came ahead of you have screwed up a lot of things, and hopefully not fatally. But, it's understandable that subsequent generations, a lot of people don't like boomers. I don't either, actually. So I understand, but I don't know if I even came close to answering that question. I think being respectful and try to understand what someone else is saying is the default setting.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
But maybe most people don't think that. Maybe that's part of the problem.
Thank you. So what's your earliest memory of becoming aware of racism?
Well, I think my answer to that is probably when I learned about the Holocaust, uh, because I grew up in the lower British properties
Okay.
a long time ago, relatively speaking. It seems like just yesterday. And
Yeah.
so, you know, at that time, you tended not to really be exposed to that many people that were of any different ethnic or racial group. But I definitely have, quite vivid memories of learning about the extermination of the Jews and concluding that if you're going to be a racist, then be a racist. Okay, like if you don't like a certain ethnic group, then the only logical thing is to try to kill them. And that's why any kind of ism like that is bad. So I think that's where I sort of maybe form my opinions that that's not where you want to go, like even close to it. And of course, there's people that are hypocrites that will say, well, yeah, I mean, like, I don't like Chinese people, but I mean, like, I don't want to kill them. Well, like, make up your mind. That's kind of my harsh view of that. So I'm not really very tolerant of intolerance because of that. Now, whether that's a logical place that I ended up in, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's not for me to say, but that's the answer to the question of when I first, like, I didn't sort of, run into somebody who was treating someone else differently and, was shocked by it.
Right.
Because I was quite aware that people could go to great extremes on that basis.
What are some good books to learn about racism? Do you have any like recommendation?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that one. I think any good history of World War II and Nazi Germany, because if you want to see racists, like they were right up there, and they were unashamed racists. Like they didn't hide it the way Republicans do. They were proud of it, and they acted on it. And so I think to really understand, where that approach to treating other people leads and what it involves, I think everyone should know that. And if they did, they might not march around holding Nazi flags. Oh, they might too, but at least you'd know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And the other type of book that I think is good is there's a book by a person named Stephen Jay Gould, who is an American science writer and paleontologist. Anything by him is good, so write that down. But he wrote a book called The Mismeasure of Man, which is about how IQ tests were corrupted and falsified in the US in like the 19 teens, I guess, because they started doing them during World War I and in the 1920s to show that anyone but whites was inferior. And that was sort of the basis of what's termed scientific racism, which is kind of a oxymoron. But the idea being that there's a basis for this kind of discrimination, the same way that someone will produce a study saying that women have lower IQs. And therefore, all of this other stuff follows, because I think some people aren't comfortable with hating without pretending that there's some basis in reality for it, but that, there's facts behind it. So that's why conspiracy theorists and racists and people like that are always finding made up facts and twisted things. Same with climate deniers, you name it, like you can pick your favorite group to try to justify their behavior because they can't admit that they're just horrible people. They want to say and have people think, well, there's a reason for this. And I mean, the justifications for American slavery were full of things like that. You know, blacks couldn't govern themselves, you know, and they would never do anything unless you made them. And, you know, they spent decades coming up with all these justifications because they weren't willing to admit that, you know, there was a socioeconomic benefit, that they just wanted these people to work for nothing. So I think that book, The Mismeasure of Man, is actually, I've read it several times, and I think it's a really good sort of explanation, and it's pretty horrifying in its own way, of, you know, how eminent scientists at famous universities, you know, basically would sell out. I mean, the same with the studies showing how good smoking is for you. You know, I mean, there's no end to what people will do.
Yeah, thank you for your recommendations. Finally, do you have anything else you would like to say to the audience that are going to be watching this podcast episode?
I'm tempted to say, you know, while there's death, there's hope. You know, that it's easy as you get older to think the world is getting worse. And especially during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And, you know, when I talk to guys like you know, you realize that, like, it's actually not true. And, you know, you're sort of like the only hope. So, you know, the world can't be changed quickly. And I don't know how much it gets changed by, say, marches as opposed to voting and, you know, doing things little by little, you know, on an individual basis, and, you know, kind of being an example of what people should be, as opposed to what many of them are. And, you know, say when you look at the US, I mean, at times it looks hopeless, but then you fast forward, say, 10 years, and you think of how the demographics and the cultural views of, even in the United States, are evolving. And so maybe that's the message, that, you know, if everyone does something, a lot gets done.
Okay, I think that's a really good message, because if we don't do anything, like even small things, then the world would not get better.
Also, if you don't do anything,
Yeah.
then you're kind of enabling the people that are doing things wrong.
Thank you so much for coming to the podcast. We have had such a great time just talking about racism and our opinions and thoughts about people around the world.
Thank you to everyone who has stayed tuned into the end. Stay tuned for next week's podcast episode.
I have a very special guest joining us and sharing their experiences with racism. As always, let's keep the conversation going.